There is a photograph, and once you have seen it, you don't forget it. A tank stopped in a field in Normandy with black smoke pouring out of every hatch and seam, the way smoke pours out of a house that is finished. The crew are already out or they are not, and either way the machine is done. It is a boxy, tall, honest-looking thing, this tank. American-built. The most produced tank the Western Allies ever made. And within a year of the war ending, people had a nickname for it, and the nickname was cruel. They called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because, they said, it lit first time every time. The Germans, the story goes, had a name too, the Tommy Cooker, the Tommy being the British soldier, and the Cooker being what this tank supposedly turned into the moment a shell touched it. A rolling coffin, a death trap, a petrol-fed bonfire that they sent good men into anyway. That's the story. That's the reputation that has followed this machine for 80 years. And I want you to hold that burning tank in your mind, because I am about to tell you that nearly everything you just felt about it is wrong. Not softened, not exaggerated, wrong. And the truth is a far better story than the myth. Right. Let me wipe my hands and say hello properly. The name's Reg. For the best part of 40 years I was the bloke who kept old military vehicles running, a fitter, a mechanic, a restorer, whatever you want to call it. If it had an engine and a track and it had been shot at some time before I was born, sooner or later it ended up in my workshop, leaking oil onto my floor and testing my patience. And I will tell you something that took me half my life to properly understand. I used to be a specs man. I used to stand in front of a big German tank, a Tiger, a Panther, all that beautiful thick armor and that lovely long gun, and I'd go weak at the knees like everybody else. And then I spent a few decades with a wrench in my hand, actually keeping machines alive, and I changed my mind completely. Because the machine I ended up loving most, the one I'd want under me if my life depended on getting home, isn't the glamorous one. It's this old girl, the Sherman, the tank everybody thinks they can laugh at. So let's have this out, you and me. Let's talk about how she really died, how she really lived, and why she is one of the most misunderstood machines of the entire war. Start with the myth, because it's a good one, and like all good myths, it's got just enough truth in it to be dangerous. The story says the Sherman burned because it ran on petrol. Gasoline, if you're American. And the logic sounds airtight, doesn't it? Petrol is a fire waiting to happen. The German tanks, people will tell you, ran on diesel, which is much harder to light. So the Germans were safe and the Yanks and the Brits were riding around inside a full jerrycan. Neat. Tidy. The kind of fact that gets repeated in the pub and in documentaries and in the comments under every tank video ever posted. There's just one problem with it. It's rubbish. And I don't say that to be clever, I say it because the truth is one of those things that, once a mechanic explains it to you, you can never unknow. First, the diesel bit. The German cats, the Panther and the Tiger, the tanks people hold up as the safe, sensible ones, they didn't run on diesel. They ran on petrol, same as the Sherman. Big thirsty petrol engines, the lot of them. So if petrol was the killer, the Germans were sitting in exactly the same puddle. The whole diesel good, petrol bad story falls apart the second you actually look at what these machines had bolted in the back. And here's the harder truth underneath it, the one that matters. Tanks in the Second World War did not mostly burn because of their fuel at all. Let me put my mechanic's hat on and take you inside, because this is the bit that changed how I see the whole war. When a tank got hit, really hit, when an armor-piercing shot punched through the steel, the thing that turned that tank into that photograph from the cold open, the thing that produced the roaring, instant, catastrophic fire, was very often not the petrol tank. It was the ammunition. Think about what's inside a tank. It's not just a crew and an engine. It's a mobile magazine. It is carrying dozens of large shells, and each of those shells sits on top of a charge of propellant, the stuff that throws it out of the gun. Propellant is designed to burn ferociously fast. That is its entire job. And when a red-hot lump of metal or a spray of molten fragments comes punching through the armor at enormous speed and finds those propellant charges stored around the inside of the fighting compartment, that is your fire. That is your instant inferno, not a slow petrol blaze, a propellant flash that fills the whole inside of the tank in a heartbeat. The tankers had a word for it. They called it brewing up, and it wasn't unique to the Sherman. It happened to every tank of the era on every side when the ammunition took a hit. It happened to the Panthers. It happened to the Tigers. Those diesel-that-were-actually-petrol German cats brewed up in exactly the same horrible way, because they were carrying exactly the same kind of propellant in exactly the same kind of steel box. The fire didn't care what nationality you were. It cared whether the shot found your ammunition. Now I promised you accuracy, and accuracy is the whole reason I bother doing this. So let me flag something honestly rather than pretend it's all settled. Did petrol ever contribute to a tank fire? Of course it could. Fuel is fuel and fire is fire, and a battlefield is a chaotic place. I'm not standing here telling you a Sherman's fuel could never catch. That would be its own daft myth in the other direction. What the evidence points to, and what the people who actually studied the burned-out tanks concluded, is that the main driver of those catastrophic fires was the ammunition, not the fuel. That's the honest version. Not petrol had nothing to do with it, but the ammunition was the real story. And the petrol tale is where the blame got misplaced. And while we're being honest, that famous nickname, the Ronson, the lighter that lights first time every time, I'd take that one with a very large pinch of salt as well. Here's the awkward thing that the storytellers tend to skip. That particular Ronson advertising slogan, the first time, every time line everybody quotes, there's a good case that it dates from after the war, not during it. Which would mean the wartime tank crews couldn't have been naming their tank after a slogan that didn't exist yet. So the whole vivid, memorable, oft-repeated Ronson story may well be a bit of post-war myth-making. A neat legend that grew up later and got stapled onto the machine. I can't prove to you it's false, and you'll find people who will argue it either way. So I'll do what I always do and just lay my cards on the table. Treat the Ronson nickname as likely apocryphal. A good story, probably not a true one. But here's where it gets genuinely brilliant, and here's where you see the difference between a legend and an engineering problem. Because the Americans didn't sit around arguing about nicknames. They did what good engineers do. They found the real cause, the ammunition, and they went after it. The fix was one of those ideas so simple it's almost funny, and it's my favorite thing in this whole story. If the fires start in the ammunition, then protect the ammunition. So they redesigned where and how the shells were stored. They moved a lot of the ammunition lower down, off the walls of the fighting compartment, down into the hull. And then this is the clever part. They surrounded the ammunition bins with liquid, water, mixed with antifreeze and a rust inhibitor so it wouldn't freeze or corrode. Jackets of liquid wrapped around the shell storage. They called it wet stowage. And the idea is beautifully mechanical. If a shot penetrates and reaches those bins, the liquid floods the propellant, soaks it, drowns the spark before it can flash. You take the tank's most dangerous cargo and you wrap it in a fire break. And it worked. The proportion of Shermans that caught fire after being penetrated dropped, and it dropped a lot once wet stowage came in. Same tank, same petrol engine that everybody blamed. But now, when it got hit, far more crews got the chance to climb out and walk away. That is not a death trap. That is a machine that its engineers kept quietly making safer in the middle of a war because they understood the real problem instead of the popular one. And I want to give the Sherman her due on one more thing that never makes it into the death trap story, because it matters more than any of it. She was, by the standards of a tank in a shooting war, a good machine to get out of. 5 men crewed her, and she had decent hatches, sensibly placed, and a layout that gave a frightened crew a fighting chance of bailing out fast when the worst happened. That sounds like a small thing until you remember what the alternative is. A tank crew doesn't just want armor that stops the shot. They know, deep down, that some shots get through no matter what you ride in. What they want almost as much is the chance to survive the hit and climb out into the daylight. And on that quiet, unglamorous, life-or-death measure, will this thing let my crew escape? The Sherman did better than her reputation by a mile. Ask the men who actually rode in her, and a great many of them will tell you they'd take her over anything the other side had. The men inside didn't call her a death trap. That was mostly the people who never had to. Right. Deep breath. Let me tell you why I actually love this tank, because busting the myth is only half of it. The other half is the thing the myth stops people from ever seeing. The Sherman was not built to be the best tank in the world. Let me say that plainly, because it's the key to everything. It was never trying to win a duel of the spec sheets. It was built to be the tank you could make by the tens of thousands, ship across an entire ocean, land on a beach, and then actually keep running day after day, mile after mile, in the mud, in the desert, in the snow, with ordinary tools and ordinary blokes. And on the thing that actually wins wars, she was magnificent. Start with the numbers, because the numbers are staggering. Something like 49,000 Shermans were built. 49,000. Let that sink in. This was not a workshop turning out hand-fitted masterpieces one at a time. This was Detroit. This was the American car industry, Ford, Chrysler, the whole roaring machine that had spent the previous 30 years learning how to build motor cars for the masses, turned, almost overnight, to building tanks the same way. On production lines, to standard patterns, with interchangeable parts. And that word, interchangeable, is where a mechanic's heart starts to beat faster. And I can never talk about the Sherman without stopping, for a moment, on the people who actually built her, because to me they are the real heroes of this story, more than any general. Picture the factory floor. This wasn't a handful of master craftsmen in leather aprons. This was a whole nation put to work, men too old to fight and boys too young, and women, hundreds of thousands of women who'd never touched a welding torch in their lives, stepping onto the line, learning to weld hull plate and torque down running gear and run the great presses, and doing it well, doing it fast, doing it better than anyone had any right to expect. Every one of those 49,000 tanks was somebody's shift, somebody standing at a bench for 10 hours, welding the same seam, so that a lad they'd never meet on a beach on the far side of the world would have something reliable under him. When people talk about what won the war, they picture the battlefield. I picture the factory. I picture the woman on the night shift with the sparks coming off her torch. She won it as much as anybody did, and she never gets the film made about her. Well, she gets a mention from me. Every time. Let me explain why, because unless you've had your hands inside these machines, it's easy to miss just how much this mattered. Imagine 2 tanks are knocked out of action. Not destroyed, just broken, a thrown track, a dead final drive, a shot-up road wheel, the ordinary wear and damage of every single day at war. Now, one of those tanks is a rare, superbly engineered, hand-fitted marvel, where the replacement part has to be ordered from a factory hundreds of miles away, and half the time it doesn't quite fit without a skilled man filing it to size. And the other is a Sherman, where the part is one of 100,000 identical parts, sitting in a crate at a depot just behind the line, and a tired corporal with a spanner and a manual can have it swapped and the tank back in the fight by morning. Which army wins? Not the one with the prettier tank. The one whose tanks keep coming back. A tank in a field workshop being fixed is worth infinitely more than a tank that's technically superior and permanently broken. And the Sherman was built from the ground up to be fixed. Reliable engine. Parts you could get. A layout you could actually work on. She'd start in the cold. She'd keep going when the fancy machines were sat by the roadside waiting for a specialist. My old workshop partner Stan, you'll hear me moan about Stan. Stan always says the best tank is the one that's running. And for once in his life, the miserable old devil is completely right. And she moved. That's the other thing that gets forgotten. The Sherman was quick, nimble for her size, reliable over long distances. She could motor for miles and be trusted to arrive. The heavy German cats, for all their armor and all their gun, were forever breaking down, forever drinking fuel they didn't have, forever too heavy for the bridges, sinking into soft ground, throwing their complicated running gear. A tiger that can't cross the bridge and can't get the fuel and can't be recovered when it breaks is a very expensive garden ornament. A Sherman that just keeps trundling forward is a war machine in the truest sense. And here's a bit of the puzzle people forget entirely because it happens a long way from the battlefield. Before a single Sherman could fire a shot in France, somebody had to get it there. Across an ocean, in the belly of a ship, and a tank that's too heavy, too wide, too awkward is a nightmare to load, to ship, to unload, to move up rutted roads and over tired little bridges to the front. This is where being sensible instead of enormous pays off in gold. The Sherman was built to a size and a weight you could actually move around the planet in the numbers you needed. You could pack the ships. You could cross the bridges. You could recover her when she got stuck, drag her back, patch her up, send her forward again. The Germans, meanwhile, built magnificent monsters that were forever too heavy for the bridge, too wide for the railway, too thirsty for the fuel that was never there. A weapon you cannot deliver to the fight is not a weapon. It's a museum piece with ambition. Half the Sherman's genius was decided in a shipyard and a rail depot, long before anyone loaded a shell. I restored a Sherman once, well, we restored her, me and Stan, and mostly we argued over her. Old girl I ended up calling Bessie, because for the first 3 months she absolutely would not start, and I said some things to that tank that I won't repeat with the camera on. But here's the thing. Once we understood her, and it didn't take a genius, that's the point, she was honest. Everything on her was there to be reached and gripped and undone and fixed. She wasn't temperamental. She wasn't precious. She was a working machine built by people who assumed she'd need working on and who'd made that as painless as they possibly could. And the day Bessie finally caught, and that big engine turned over and settled into a steady beat after all those weeks, I'm not ashamed to tell you I had a bit of a moment. That's not a death trap. That's a friend. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you she was perfect, because she wasn't. And if I did that, I'd be no better than the people who called her a death trap, just wrong in the opposite direction. Let's be honest about where she genuinely fell short, because the honest version is more interesting than either fairy tale. The big one is the gun. The Sherman went into the hard fighting of Normandy with a 75mm gun that was a fine, versatile weapon for most of what a tank actually does. But it struggled badly against the front armor of the heavy German tanks. When a Sherman met a Panther or a Tiger head-on, at range that 75 could put a shot square on the enemy's frontal plate and watch it bounce off. And that is a horrible thing to ask a crew to live with, to know that the enemy in front of you can kill you from a distance at which you cannot reliably kill him back. That was real. That was a genuine failing, and men paid for it. I'm not going to dress it up. And she was tall. The Sherman had a high, boxy silhouette, partly a consequence of the engine they built her around, and a tall tank is an easier tank to see and to hit. On a battlefield where being spotted first often meant being killed first, that height was a real disadvantage. So there you are, a gun that couldn't crack the heavy cats from the front, and a body that stood up tall and proud when it should have been keeping its head down. Genuine weaknesses. No excuses. But watch what happens next, because this is the same story as the wet stowage all over again, and it's the thing I most want you to take away about how the Allies actually fought. They didn't fall in love with their tank and refuse to admit its faults. They fixed them. The gun problem got answered in two ways. The Americans upgunned her. They put a longer, harder-hitting 76mm gun into the Sherman, a gun with a much better chance against heavy armor. And the British did something even bolder, and it's one of my favorite bits of improvisation in the whole war. They took the standard Sherman and they crammed into her a monster of a gun called the 17-pounder, a British anti-tank gun that hit like the wrath of God. They had to modify the turret, angle the radio into a box on the back, lay the gun on its side to fit, and rework the whole loading, proper backyard genius engineering. But when they'd finished, they had a Sherman that could kill a Tiger. They called her the Firefly, for the great flash the big gun made when it fired. And suddenly the mocked, outgunned Sherman had a version that the heavy cats were genuinely afraid of. Same reliable, buildable, fixable tank. Now with teeth. That's not a death trap either. That's a platform good enough and simple enough that you could keep bolting better ideas onto it until it did the job. There's one more thing I have to mention, and I'm going to flag it clearly as one of those points that historians genuinely argue about, so you take it as a debate and not as gospel. The idea at the time, the doctrine, the plan on paper, was that the Sherman was never really meant to go toe-to-toe with heavy enemy tanks in the first place. The theory went that killing enemy tanks was the job of specialized vehicles, the tank destroyers, while the Sherman got on with supporting the infantry, exploiting breakthroughs, being everywhere at once. So when people say the Sherman was undergunned for tank versus tank fighting, the defenders reply, well, it wasn't supposed to be doing that fight in the first place. And the critics fire back that on the actual battlefield, doctrine or no doctrine, Shermans absolutely did end up nose-to-nose with Panthers and Tigers, and the men inside couldn't exactly call a timeout and wait for the right vehicle to turn up. Both sides have a point. Historians still go round and round on how well that whole doctrine really worked. I'm not going to pretend I've settled an argument that people who have spent their whole careers on it haven't. I'll just flag it honestly as disputed and move on to the part that actually decided things. Because here's the turn. Here's the thing that took me 40 years and a lot of skinned knuckles to really believe. The Sherman won. Not the individual duel, she often lost that, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the war, the thing that actually matters. The tank that got laughed at, the Ronson, the Tommy Cooker, the supposed death trap with the pop gun and the tall body. It was on the winning side, in overwhelming numbers, in every theater, from the deserts of North Africa to the beaches of France to the far side of the Pacific, and the beautiful, terrifying, individually superior German cats, the tigers and panthers that win every argument on paper and every fantasy in a lad's bedroom they lost. And it wasn't luck. Sit with the arithmetic of it. The Germans built their heavy tanks in the hundreds and low thousands, complex, expensive, hungry, hard to build, hard to fix, hard to move. The Allies built the Sherman in the tens of thousands, simple, cheap, reliable, shippable, fixable. A tiger might knock out several Shermans before it fell. Genuinely, that happened. But there was always another Sherman, and another, and the one that broke down got fixed and came back, while the tiger that broke down got abandoned because there was no bridge that would take it and no easy part to fix it and no fuel to move it. Quantity, when it's reliable quantity, when every single unit actually works and keeps working, quantity has a quality all its own, and it goes deeper than counting tanks, because a reliable machine changes what the crews can even attempt. If you trust your tank to start, to run, to get you there and get you back, you can be bold. You can push and range wide and take the ground because the machine under you isn't a gamble, it's a certainty. The crews who fought in Shermans could plan around the fact that their tanks would, overwhelmingly, actually work. That confidence is worth more than an inch of armor. It's the difference between an army that lunges and an army that hesitates. Give me 1,000 tanks a crew can rely on over 100 they have to nurse and pray over, and I'll give you back a war one, not because the tank was superb, but because it was there and it worked, and it kept its promise to the men inside. That's the lesson the Sherman teaches, and it's why she's the machine I'd want my name on. The engineers who designed her didn't chase the highest number in any single column. They didn't build the thickest armor or the biggest gun or the most fearsome one-on-one killer. They built the tank that American industry could actually pour out by the thousand, that could actually cross the actual ocean, that ordinary soldiers could actually keep running with ordinary tools in the actual mud. They engineered for production. They engineered for maintenance. They engineered for the whole ugly, unglamorous reality of a global war, and that, not the duel, is what a war is actually made of. Every part of that photograph in the cold open, the smoke and the ruin, was real. War is like that. And I'll never pretend the men who crewed these machines had it anything other than terrifying. But the tank in the picture wasn't a death trap sent out by fools. It was a genuinely clever machine, made safer year by engineers who understood the real problem, built in numbers that no enemy could match, and kept running by men with spanners who were the real, unsung heroes of the whole thing. The glamour was all on the other side. The winning was on ours. And here's where I turn it round on you, because I didn't spend all this time on one old tank just to settle a pub argument about the Second World War. I think about the Sherman and the Tiger a lot, out in the workshop, and I don't really think about tanks anymore when I do. I think about us, about the way we're wired to fall for the flashy best over the reliable mini, every single time. We do it with everything. We drool over the fastest car, the one that spends half its life in the garage. We chase the most impressive-looking option, the one with the biggest number on the box, and we quietly overlook the plain, dependable, unglamorous thing that would actually show up for us day after day and just work. We're all Tiger fans at heart. We want the masterpiece, and the war was won by the tool that started on a cold morning. I've watched it my whole working life. The rare, beautiful machine that everybody admires and nobody can keep running. And the humble, honest, good-enough machine that quietly does the job, gets fixed in an afternoon, and is still going long after the masterpiece has been pushed into a corner. And I've come to believe that knowing the difference, really knowing it, in your bones is a kind of wisdom. Reliability is not boring. Reliability is the whole game. The thing that shows up and works is worth more than the thing that dazzles and fails. And that's as true of people and jobs and plans and lives as it ever was of tanks. My granddad drove one of these, as it happens, a Sherman, across France and into Germany. He never called her a death trap. He called her reliable, and when he said it, it sounded like the highest praise he had. It took me most of my life to understand that he was right, and that he was talking about more than a tank. So that's my question for you, and I do read the comments, so tell me straight. What's the Sherman in your life? What's the plain, dependable, good enough thing, a car, a tool, a machine, a person, that everybody underrates but that has never once let you down? And be honest. Are you a Tiger man or a Sherman man when it actually counts? I genuinely want to know. Put it down below. I'm off to have another argument with Stan about whether Bessie's carburetor needs stripping again. He says no, he's wrong. He's always wrong. And if you liked having the myth taken apart and the real machine put back together, then subscribe and stick around, because I've got a whole workshop full of misunderstood old girls to introduce you to: the ugly one that won, the beautiful one that failed, the daft-looking idea that was secretly genius. The name's Reg. Mind the hot exhaust on your way out. And next time somebody at the pub tells you the Sherman was a flaming death trap, you smile, and you buy them a drink, and you tell them the far better story of how she really lived.